Okay, I think it's a good time for me to make another somewhat thorough summary of, in some sense, my latest thinking on how to classify the conundrum of our times um in the culture war, uh, and to rehash and to hopefully in a fairly logical flow get a full track on this very strange set of philosophical sentiments, and which has many pathological manifestations. Yeah, so there are a lot of subtopics that I want to cover in this. So let me just get right in. So, where to begin? Okay, so I don't know. I'm not going to title everything that I'm going to then explain, but essentially, my thesis is something like identity politics, feminism in its current incarnation, is basically a form of chauvinism, a cleverly disguised chauvinism as a defensive reaction to what is generally characterized as a kind of as a historical ongoing suppression and subversion, there's a kind of innate implicit history that is present in real time. And so, by being cast in the shadow of the systemic oppression which is laden within the system, one can only but one has to orientate oneself in terms of fighting uh, that vector of evil. So it has this very clear definition of what is wrong and what is evil. It has, let's say, a negative value which it knows to be true, and therefore it can justify right action in reaction to the negative values. And so it's so it defines evil, but it doesn't necessarily, and it then defines good as essentially defeating or vanquishing and reacting to that evil. Now, uh, I'm going to say that almost on a psychological level, it commits a fundamentally fatal flaw in that it does not bootstrap identity and culture to be in the responsibility of the individual who has an identity or a culture. It basically says that your culture was inherited by you in a systemic power game or something like that. That it has these associations attached to it, and therefore, and those are socially unjust. It's taken the phrase social justice, which was actually an Orwellian phrase, and it has reinterpreted it to mean group versus group, as opposed to the individual versus institutions and society as a collective. Um, it's quite sad. Uh, but anyway, that particular perversion. I'm sure Orwell is rolling in his grave. Um, so I'm going to now argue that this framework and this worldview is essentially rehashed Nazi philosophy. This is the same format of belief uh, uh, that any fascistic worldview is premised in. Essentially, you get an identity. That identity is locked into some kind of conflagration, um, and there's a mythology attached to the identity, which and because essentially, I mean, it's tried to say that it's historical causation is always, let's say, a plausible reduction to interpret a situation. You can always reduce a situation and analyze it, in the lens of historical causation. But if you do that, then essentially self-determinism, agency, essentially they don't survive that form of analysis. So you end up essentially looking past or looking through the role of accountability and responsibility. Essentially do not exist in the narrative, which is essentially a narrative about the identity, which is something that is a kind of thematic attribute which is fundamentally linked to the world itself. It is part of the conditionality of the world. It is part of, it's something that you can see, touch, or feel. It's something that you can measure in some way. It is there's a kind of empirical marking around it that is the force of the congregation, or clumping to that property, which is then claimed has this baggage attached to it, has this mythology attached to it. And then you can just say, well, history really happened, therefore the mythology is real, or something like that. Now, okay, that's a rather minor point. Now, the function of the mythology is to disguise chauvinism. In this generalized abstraction of the identity and the mythology around the identity, it means that moral causation is narrated by the mythology. You don't actually have to look at accountability and responsibility and track actual events. You just end up with, in some sense, stereotypes and tropes that you just kind of work out who is playing what role in the morality play, which is a kind of orthodoxy or sort of dogmatic script, which is essentially the ideological framework and worldview. So it oversimplifies reality by creating a cartoon version of it, which is effectively a kind of a mythology which is rehashed and alive in everything. Sort of everything is symbolic of the mythology. Now, the problem with the mythologies in identity politics fundamentally, not only that they are dehumanizing and that they essentially remove moral consideration from the individual and place it in a locus or in a nexus, which is a kind of abstract entity of a group entity. So the group owns its members of that group, and the group has a moral consideration and moral rights. The individual has no moral rights. The individual is a reflection or a representation of the moral rights accorded to the group entity. It is kind of, there's this laden identitarian essentialism that is fundamentally woven into its operation. And in as much as that there is lip service given to the fact that, oh, well, it's only, let's say, a necessary endorsement of a kind of de facto identitarian essentialism, but that's a means to an end until we reach some kind of reset point, until the mythology has been played out and discharged by some kind of countervailing process which everyone has to sort of be in conformity with. But essentially this is how it operates in practice. It's sort of either overt sexism or overt racialism or whatever the identitarian aspect is, that it's fundamentally vested in that being the source of moral consideration, and in some sense the thing that bestows a kind of ideological integrity or dignity, which is there to supplement the historical baggage. That's how the mythology reads. Now, just to properly distinguish this from fascism, because there are some minor distinctions that are worth talking about. Identitarian politics, depending on its variety, in the version of feminism, I think especially, cannot really be considered full-blown fascism. I would call it proto-fascism. Hitler would have called these people useful idiots because they promote the format of the fascistic worldview. They normalize fascistic politics and fascistic values. But essentially, the mythology that feminism brings to the table is not one in which, for example, a political party could be exclusively devoted for. You can't have a feminist party. You have to have a party that will kneel to feminist ideals or pay some kind of lip service. But in some sense, that lip service, especially if it's if this party is paying homage to many different identitarian wedge issues, they can never devote themselves properly to any particular identitarian faction, because the state fundamentally cannot be governed. It does not translate into a functional political platform, because in the fascistic worldview, you need an identitarian mythology that is capable of perpetuating itself. That's capable of reproducing the state, as it were. And so, the Nazi mythology was, let me just reduce it down to two things, essentially, although it's also somewhat more than this, but is basically blood and soil and genetics. So if you reduce the mythology around your identity to blood and soil and genetics, that allows the state to reproduce itself. I would also say that there's another thing which is needed, which the proto-fascists certainly have, which is a scapegoat. Because the mythology is it's such a pathetic lens through which to reduce the world into. It's such a stupefying, form of analysis, that you end up having to have a pressure release valve, and so the Jewish conspiracy theory is no different than the conspiracy of the white patriarchy. They perform the same function. Okay. Now I'm just going to move on into some sort of ancillary matters that are somewhat related to these issues, which might not be interesting to some people, but might add some insight or interesting take. I think that essentially, where was I? I wanted to talk about Heidegger, but that's a really tangential point. And I wanted to talk about the psychological component. Yeah, that's important to talk about. Okay, so let me just tell you a story which may or may not be true. I think it probably is true. I believe that what happened to Hitler was that Hitler had a primary female caregiver, either his mother or his aunt that raised him, who had borderline personality disorder. And I think he sympathized with that female caregiver, and I think he tried to craft a political ideology that would be capable of housing individuals that had that kind of temperament. Hitler's mother, by the way, was institutionalized. I can't remember what they call them, but anyway. And so, I just want to use this as a springboard to talk about the psychological impact that this kind of culture has on people, the stupefying impact that it has on society and culture. Is that basically what fascism and fascistic politics do is that they produce a kind of social psychology and a kind of conventions around social psychology which must be concorded with by everyone. Everyone has to somewhat follow the rules lockstep. And what the social psychology in fact does is that it allows individuals to indulge in a kind of relativism about their own personal specialness. So their identity becomes exalted by the social psychology. Their identity becomes the central axle and the core of the universe. Sort of the source of a kind of cosmic morality and things like that. And there is a cost to this. There is a cost to losing liberal values and liberal politics, which is generally sort of the sense of accountability. Because when you've got this very special power, your identity and a mythology attached to it, every time that there's a glitch in the matrix, there's a defect. The cause of the defect, is the conspiracy theory, is the scapegoat has infiltrated. Even after all the Jews were rounded up and put in concentration camps, the Germans were still complaining that the Jewish conspiracy had gotten so deep that it had infiltrated the psychology of the German people, because not everyone could essentially get on board because they had been so corrupted. You can see this reflected in the same kind of sentiments around woke ideology, and feminism. What do they call it? I can't remember exactly the phrase, but it's something like inculcated male misogyny or something like that, or internalized internalized oppression or something, some such phrases. And this also means that if you want to have a positive action, if you want something to normal, I'm using the word normalize too much, but you can call for it by defining it as a grievance of something that was essentially already that the deprivation is a lineage of the mythological conflagration with the scapegoat. And so you can disguise positive motivation as a kind of as an accusation and a grievance. And so it's kind of like a one size fits all implement and solution to every problem. And so the ideology becomes a touchstone and a lens which can become an all encompassing portal to deliver and engage in every activity in life. The problem is that it has to increasingly expand its and inflate itself into more obvious garbage and essentially irrational nonsense. I often thought, if you listen to these feminists, and it really is hard to listen to them, because the layers of impute, there's so much projection and imputing, onto history. There's so much projection, because what you say about history, you can then say, well, you're carrying this and you're imposing it onto me. It's, such an external locus of control. It's so self-disempowering. And implicitly chauvinistic, is if you just replace, okay, well, how do you want to organize things? How do you want things arranged? But you're not allowed to say, let's just say if you were heterosexual and you were a feminist, and you, then how would you want to have a relationship regulated? And don't say the man does this and the woman does this. Just say partner one and partner two. How should the things be regulated? Say partner one should do this and partner two, because then that would expose the chauvinism. If they had to say partner one and partner two, then they would see the unequal dynamics that they are imposing and projecting and getting away with. But obviously they can't do that because they would be allergic to doing it. No, because you can't take people outside of history. You can't say that no, the mythology isn't in force. Without the mythology, they don't have a they don't have an actionable program to do anything with. So it really does become an all-encompassing total narrative that must be given allegiance to. And they can't operate without it. It becomes a crutch, which then sort of becomes part of themselves, and sort of grafts onto them, and they can't live without it. But I mean, there is so much fundamental bad faith about it that it is rather disgusting. But rather than just airing my disgust, let me also just add this other point, which is quite interesting, is that now I've just lost it. Oh yes. I mean, I guess this is not a stark point to make. This is just a kind of observation. Is obviously my opinion, but sort of, if you have free time on your hands, what men and boys might do is they might play a video game. But I think that these feminists, essentially, because they don't have activities, they don't have, or especially the ones that go into this kind of stuff, it becomes their project. It really is filling a hole in their soul. And in some sense, it's obviously incredibly psychologically unhealthy. I mean, you can see it quite evidently. It's quite obvious that these people have a kind of ideological toxin that they need to inject into someone. That they need to find someone who will take the punishment, in some sense. But anyway, they need to proselytize it, they need to spread it, and I think that is almost like a kind of video game in itself for them. It really has the properties of a fire. If it doesn't grow, it's dying. If it doesn't catch alight more things, it can't sort of anyway. Anyway, there's a parallel point of all this, which is essentially liberal politics. You see, the reason why it's important to bootstrap your culture and your identity as belonging to an individual self-determinism is because otherwise, you don't have a democratically literate entity that can actually participate in a polity. And you are already engineering the elements of a kind of feudalism, and in some sense you can see how stupidly these identitarians and identity politics people, because essentially the ideology is so impractical and inactionable that it usually manifests as a kind of virtue signaling to the narrative, to the mythology, and elites and powerful people can then perform these virtue signals, and then you don't get any real progressive development on any issue. You can't have real democratic politics with this shit in the way, essentially. So it's very sad because it sets everything back. I mean, you can also see how the identitarians, if the West actually had its act together, for the third world and the developing world to not have an intact culture to model itself after, but to have this disgusting culture war, you're setting back first wave feminism in many countries to a huge degree. I mean, this is so damaging to actual people's lives and such. Which these new breed of feminists have completely given up on. No. These traditional societies have been damaged by white patriarchy. It doesn't matter that so let's give room to these cultures, these traditional cultures, as they continue to oppress their women and such. And it's completely retrograde. But the hypocrisies and whatever, it's all principles and values go by the wayside when you're driven by a mythology and a narrative, essentially, and you become a cog that's easy to manipulate. And essentially, it all stems from this horrible philosophical attitude of saying, oh no, well, someone's culture or their identity is damaged by history or damaged by the system, and therefore they're not responsible for who they are or what they are or something like that. And then you don't even have something that you can rehabilitate or progressively develop or transform. You can't transform someone's life if you don't give them the dignity of self-determinism and agency. It's philosophically corrupt at its core. It disempowers people. And so what it often does is it makes prescriptions that lead to worse outcomes, and then it recycles those bad outcomes as an excuse to double down and to a furthering of the same bad solution that causes the damage in the first place. It can't even take responsibility for its own failed policy whenever it does get institutional power, and it produces horrible outcomes. It always just passes the buck and it says, well, that's why we need more radical activism or some more virtue signaling, and more people have to realize that this is the correct narrative, this is the correct mythology. That's all it becomes. It's basically a mind virus. But anyway, Okay, so let me just re-emphasize that all these themes mean that, when people use the excuse of social psychology, just know that they're basically using a kind of witchcraft at that point. And this is the problem that I have with Brett Weinstein, is that he is completely on board with that kind of bullshit, which in some sense, in my view, really, it means that he has offered intellectual sympathy with proto-fascism, and which he does. He does, and he says these things, and they are horribly off note to my ear. They're horribly egregious, and without these kinds of principles and values intact, it's not possible. It's just not possible to actually mount an effective cultural reconfiguration and essentially to get back to sanity. Let me just say that is also why liberal politics is so important, is because if people aren't responsible for their own psyches, if they can just latch on to this mythology around their identity, um, you've created a kind of mind slave. You've also, this whole thing can also be described in the Nietzschean language of slave morality as well. Is a perfect way of describing the stuff, but I'm not going to rehearse. I'm not going to repeat that. I have that in other recordings, but. Again, let me just see if there are any other novel points for me to make. Uh, this is not really related to but this is a philosophical note, and I shouldn't even make this. Slightly irresponsible for me to talk speculatively like this. I haven't read Heidegger, but I have spoken to people about his work, and I know a little bit about the general subject matter. Being in Time, I think, is the name of his sort of magnum opus, I think, in phenomenology. And I know some of the basic concepts that he explored within that. Famously, Heidegger was a Nazi. So how can someone who was so philosophically astute to some degree end up, being a party to basically slave morality? And here's my explanation. I think that Heidegger did uncover in his language, maybe with some errors relative to my own models. I think that from the things that I've heard about Heidegger's work, that there are even similarities in some of the structures, because he talks about things that are at hand, and if something is at hand to the mind. Oh man, I can't remember the other phrase, which is quite similar, which has a distinctly different meaning, or things that are on hand, or something like that. So at hand means perhaps that it's accessible, and it's right there in the vicinity. It's in the context in some sense. And when it's on hand, it's sort of like you're presently working on it, within the scope of your mind. And anyway, and I think that these things might have some correlation to to general concepts that I've spoken about recently, which I haven't, I think, released these recordings yet, but I will. But anyway, and I think that he did discover within his own language and with his own structures and his own phenomenological inquiry, distinct structures and how they interrelate with one another. But because he didn't perhaps get all the pieces of the puzzle right, and he didn't work out how they could be integrated, he didn't, in his phenomenological inquiry, he didn't get to the stage of working out how to mend some of the implicit contradictions within, let's say, the naturally occurring structure. In some sense, he didn't work out how to develop his phenomenology far enough into a kind of self-realization that is capable of transcending just consciousness or awareness, let me rather just say, of his own ego and perhaps subconscious and unconscious. But in some sense, he didn't see that there was a grand integration to be made with those things and yet further the superego, because he didn't put all those things together. He just found a way to kind of, he ended up in a kind of worldview in which, well, these are the components that I can see and how they function. And it's basically a kind, or now I'm really putting words in his mouth and this is speculative, but I think that basically what he gets up to perhaps is that he doesn't have all the pieces of the puzzle, and the pieces that he can see working together in some kind of functional way. And because then he works out that perhaps it's basically a game that you're playing, well, then you might as well play any game. It doesn't make a difference. And then you might as well become a Nazi or something like that. That's perhaps an overextension for me to make of someone's work that I haven't read. But in some sense, that might also be, to a large extent, some kind of moralistic, very oversimplified reduction of all the postmodernists as well. That if you're going to play a game, then the only way to allow yourself to play a game is to allow moral consideration to be vested in these abstract, larger-than-life themes like identity, because then you can imagine that what you do has a kind of eternal or a potentially an everlasting impression on history as a process that you are at a particular stage or part of that procession. And so you're a piece of the process, and the only way to get a ticket to be part of the process, the grand process that is everlasting, is to essentially identify yourself or your core essence with abstractions that fundamentally are about you, are without you in the sense that they are, phenomenologically, they are external, and which you have made some kind of map of internally, and then you're going to identify with connecting with those things. And in some sense, I think that you could probably also link that to terror management of a kind of a way to overcome death denial. Anyway, all of this philosophical rambling is probably quite embarrassing, because I'm really just going very fast and loose. But those would be my general I think that is the general character of the kind of pseudo-intellectualism that attaches itself to these kinds of mythologies. The kind of, when I talk about pseudo-intellectualism, usually I'm talking about the secondary market of the kind of the apologetics, the secondary market as in that there becomes a need in order to fortify and buttress the mythology from some spectrum of criticism. And so, you get a kind of white knight type, which works out essentially how to excuse the extravagance of indulging and using this as a means to an end in some sense. And so, everything is couched in this kind of, this is actually a very useful implement, because essentially it's easy to get people behind it. I think is general. Okay, I haven't listened to these apologetics of late, because I just find it so mind-numbing. I haven't listened to anything Destiny has said in quite some years even. I can't stand to listen to that kind of pseudo-intellectualism. because whenever I listen to it, I believe that I can think through it, and it's couched in so much gainsaying and so much obtuse accusatorial sort of claiming. It's by assertion, but very carefully calibrated assertions, so as to create the perfect sort of predicate and foundation to supply a whole chain of fundamentally poisonous and self corroborating, sort of um, just very convenient, domino chains of logical links, from seemingly, somewhat innocuous basic assertions. And that's a kind of, yeah. So you can play a bit of 4D chess with moral language, and with factoids. It's just infuriating to listen to, because because I mean you can't really refute that, because I believe that that's fundamentally just a fundamental sort of bad faith, because it makes no room for contestation. Is you either buy it hook, line, and sinker, or you don't. It's either sort of appealing to you, or it isn't. Because it's just like a kind. If it's an anthem, it's a chorus supporting the mythology, essentially. But it's somewhat, it's kind of like an ivory tower of pseudo-intellectualism that is there to just kind of provide a kind of collateral support to the main mythology, and this ivory tower is somewhat more sophisticated. So it's just it's a diversionary, so if someone puts their focus on the ivory tower, then they're missing the big point. So this is why I think it's better just to just kind of avoid the secondary market of bullshit, and just to create a positive thesis, and talk about it and talk about these issues directly in essentially an alternative interpretation from a liberal politics point of view, essentially, from liberal values, classically liberal values. But there was another point for me to make of people like Destiny and stuff, and that pseudo-intellectualism is that, I mean, I believe also that why they do it, essentially, is that it's a kind of narcissistic supply. I mean, I've called these people cerebral histrionics, because they are kind of in a love affair with the mythology, with this borderline character of identity politics, and if they can support it and buttress it, then they are kind of becoming significant in their own way, and see themselves as as an integral armchair philosopher that is one of the sort of the generals that is overseeing the that is seeing their side to victory in the culture war, or something like that. But I mean, they basically commit all the problems that I've said. They just come up with sophisticated excuses, essentially, that this is the only way to get people to wake up to the chains that they wear, is essentially through this fascistic worldview. That leads me on to this last point, which is another sort of important point to make. Is I don't know, I've just lost it again. Something about the culture. Something about the nature of fascism. So, um, did I just lose it again? Fascism is I just forgot the point again. Uh, Fascism not being a right wing ideology. Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, this is a semantic thing to talk about, but it's I do think it is definitely wrong to associate fascism with the right side of the aisle in politics. It's much more correct to either call fascism its own kind of psychological perversion with its own somewhat characteristics, or to even associate it with the left. I mean, all the fascists describe themselves as socialist parties, by the way. Nazi literally means, translated into English, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was a socialist party and it was a workers' party. Now, obviously, the reason why you can describe anything as being conservative because everything will conserve something. The word conservation in the abstract, well, the conservation of anything, and these progressives, which call themselves liberals, or I think they call themselves progressives more than they call themselves liberals now. But liberation. I mean, the liberation of something could also be the conservation of some freedom to enjoy something as well. Well, I guess you can't have the conservation of a right that hasn't been delivered yet, perhaps. But yeah, or in some sense, I mean, generally the mythologies around fascism basically usually are premised in some claim that something was had at some point and then it was removed. It was encroached on by the scapegoat, by the enemy, by some opposing alien force that disrupted, that affected people's psyches, that influenced, that infiltrated their culture, and these people that have this new image of this new culture and new society, they can't even just do it. Do it where you have political power. Do it where you have enough. Just get on with it. Just do it and convince yourselves of it, and see if you can just instantiate it. But sadly, they can only do it if if there's a kind of world revolution simultaneously. Is their kind of excuse. They need to have an ability to have an absolute command value over all resources and skills, or whatever, so they can just kind of plot it as a kind of as like a Rubik's cube from the top down. But anyways, so conservation and liberation. If you want to say, well, the left is trying to value liberation and the right is trying to value conservation. I think that either of these abstract concepts can be hacked easily to be used to almost define any political position. Um, is my basic point. But what makes fascism are the things that I've argued at the beginning of this recording, is essentially where people are no longer in ownership and responsibility of their own identity or their own culture, because it has been infiltrated or it has been despoiled, it has been subverted. And then that is the kind of polemic that essentially needs a that the damage is so innate and impregnated into the state of reality that you need a Führer, you need a top-down mediator to intercess and to clean up the identity and to rehabilitate and bestow dignity on the identity, not on the individual, but on the mythology, on the mythologically shared thread of the collective entity, and that is supposedly binds a group of people together and makes them belong to the group, rather than the other way around, that the individual owns the group in their own consideration of matter, and they can liberally choose to redefine themselves as they so wish, as they can be culturally fluid. And essentially, if you don't give to people that essentially that they are responsible for their culture, for choosing their culture or not changing their culture or not adapting their culture or migrating into some kind of augmented or if you don't do that, you're not even working with a kind of humanity that is capable of legitimately having suffrage in the form of voting. I mean, they call it suffrage for a reason. There's a kind of stoicism that is built into the heart of liberal values and democracy and politics. And if you remove that substrate, which leftists, I believe, are the ones that do so, and they treat people like cattle or like a kind of insect hive of belonging to the same kind of identity faction or something like that, because it's easier to manage them on that level. It's easier to think that you can do something for them on that level, which, even Brett Weinstein is into that train of thought, that disgusting racialist train of thought, but it's for a good cause. It's for a sympathy cause, because you're doing it to help people, because then you're not holding them morally accountable for their own position that they're in, which is regressive to the point of not actually being able to stop the cycle of perpetuating the largely self-inflicted damage. And you would be able to fix the other part of the equation if you actually had democratic politics, where people actually cared about policy, and they were, in some sense, I don't think you can even say that the conditions of, in a democracy, the conditions of the system, the people, the electorate are accountable for that. If the people vote for that, then they get what they vote for. They get what they deserve in a democracy. And I do think that is largely true. You can complain about the media and things like that, but until the people actually wake up, I put it squarely on their doorstep, and I do so in order to empower them, because who you blame is who you empower. If you blame some kind of shadowy... No, I blame the people who have allowed themselves to become democratically illiterate, and to be subdued by mythologies and such, and these morally corrupt formulae of essentially there is a kind of let me just add two more points because they're important points to make. Um, these are somewhat slightly adjacent topics, but a little bit separate, but kind of tangential. Is the liberal paradox, which is that you actually have to be intolerant of intolerance in order to keep a democracy. And in some sense, I think that that is mostly true on the institutional level in terms of the media. That the media does actually have to bear some responsibility for the quality of its reporting and such like. For its kind of moral, philosophical, foundational framework. But, in some sense, the people that are drawn into journalism are usually the worst kinds of people. Cerebral histrionics, the lot of them. I mean, they are. This is untrue for. I can't say every journalist, but most journalists have a moral character that I consider to be incredibly low. These are people, or I mean, maybe it's just because they started letting in so many activists, but there are many journalists who essentially they just want to be a loudspeaker and they want to sort of be a big wig, or they want to just sort of promote an agenda or a kind of ideological slant. Not that there isn't a place, obviously there must be a place for that in journalism, to have a kind of intellectualism and to have polemics being crafted. Um, it's part of the marketplace of ideas, and is part of informing an electorate, um, and to show a range and spectrum of policy possibilities in some sense. Um, okay, but South Africa was slightly novel, I think, is because the constitution, if the law and the courts were functioning properly, the intolerance paradox is actually, I believe, capable of being enforced through the courts. I do think that the constitution is capable of defending itself, so that you wouldn't need to have a slightly extrajudicial process like the McCarthy era commission of anti-American activities, that the South African courts could actually perform that role of protecting democracy from those who would poison and create mythologies around somewhat promulgate democratic illiteracy and those sorts of things, and directly contravene and undermine the values of non-racialism and basic democratic values, where they believe in democracy, but they don't believe in liberal democratic values, and they directly undermine liberal democratic values. Because fascists love democracy because you just needed 50% plus one for them to get their totalitarianism and their authoritarianism and control of the media. You just need 50% plus one to get control of the media, and to control the narrative and indoctrinate with the mythology directly. But I do think that essentially that the courts are there to protect liberal democratic values, although they have been used to do the opposite. They've been also promulgated the undermining of non-racialism and things like that, so quite sadly, in their endorsement of the kind of identity politics worldview by one of the chief justices on the Constitutional Court. It's a huge... anyway... and the continued perversion of social justice, the reinterpretation of the Constitution to a large degree, to give the government a governmental prerogative that is not checked by the courts is absolutely insane. It's a complete derogation of the Constitution and the role of the judiciary to be a balance of powers and a check. There is no mention in the limiting clause of the Bill of Rights about a governmental prerogative. It's utterly disgusting, and it's a disgusting betrayal of the Constitution. The court itself has been part of the betrayal of the Constitution and liberal values, as they have gotten on board with this kind of fascistic authoritarianism. But anyway, let me just say that if the courts would play their role, then I think that their proper role, if they had done so, then you perhaps don't need a society that is armed. But in the much older democracy of America, you can somewhat see the wisdom of the founding fathers in the right to bear arms and a well-regulated militia. Because if you have a society that has freedom of association, I'll just give a little history, a little summary of the history of freedom of association in the Roman Empire and even the Roman Republic, you did not have the right to freely associate. Freedom of association was not a right in the ancient world, for very good reason. Because if you could freely associate, you could get together, you could make a hall, you could convince a lot of people to join a cause, to join a new ethos, to join a new way of life, to produce something, So this is also why Christians were persecuted in the ancient world, because churches were essentially were regarded as all freely associating organizations would have been regarded as a threat to the survival of the state. Because if people can freely congregate, then they can create a counterpole to the function of the state. They could try to displace the state. They could say, oh, well, we want independence in this territory, or something like that, or we want to do something else, or we want our own law, or we're going to create our own system of civilization and society that's going to sort of work under the cover of the overarching umbrella of the state or the empire. Anyway, so freedom of association is a relatively new manifestation that came out of the West, essentially. Now, I do think that the right to bear arms and to have a well-regulated militia is, in some sense, a direct... I don't know how to say this properly, but it's a direct correlate and parallel necessity for freedom of association. Because if you allow freedom of association, there's technically nothing stopping a bunch of radical people getting together and creating a cult and creating a death cult that wants to go and rampage and pillage or something like that, or try to take over the republic and make it some kind of evil empire or something like that, with an emperor, or with to install a king or something, or some tyranny, so who knows what. So the only thing that puts a check on essentially the perversion of freedom of association, and in some sense I think freedom of association is something of, it should also be seen in regard in connection with freedom of speech. Freedom of speech and freedom of association are essentially what make liberal society liberal. And it's the freedom of association is, what's the point of being able to speak freely if you can't make your own form of organization as you so wish freely? That is something of the ongoing evolution of human consciousness within the container of the liberal state. That and in some sense, people might say, well, liberals are navel gazing at the end of the day, that but that they are just contending philosophically with, the existentialist issue of the meaning of life, and they just want society to kind of be in some kind of dynamic harmony so that they can focus inwardly on their psychological state and try to, kind of progress that, or something like that, that they're fundamentally introverted or insular, or something like that. But no, I think that the point of having a liberal society is so that you can enjoy freedom of association. That is the fundamental point. Anyway, and you can perhaps invent, new forms of doing something, or doing something better, or organization, or there's no limit in some sense. Well, the only hard limit is there are certain basic things in order to preserve the liberal democratic order, as it were, or the framing, which it does itself even have some latitude within itself, to be delivered in a various assortment of ways, perhaps. Okay. Anyway, enough pontificating. So if you're going to have freedom of association, there's a dark side to freedom of association. Obviously, is that someone can go and try to invent fascism or something like that. And if someone goes and invents fascism, and then they create this little cabal of fascists that want to hold territory and maybe expand their territory, and they're very warlike or whatever, and perhaps they've already infiltrated the state and taken over the apparatus of the state or something like that. Well, the only way to safeguard against freedom of association getting itself out of hand and somewhat manifesting the intolerance paradox is that if everyone is armed, is well armed, then there's a hedge against that. It's a safety mechanism. And sadly, in South Africa, I think technically, we wouldn't need it if the courts would actually do their job that was assigned to them by the Constitution. But because they do not, and because of a lack of a judicial revolution, which is sorely needed, I mean, if the courts themselves could break away from the current constitutional court and reconvene a different constitutional court that actually upholds the Constitution and defends it, instead of betraying it and poisoning the jurisprudence that we currently sit with, like the governmental prerogative and bullshit like that, that allows them to circumvent the limitations clause of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, then we wouldn't need to look at the right to bear arms and a well-regulated militia, but it's just I'm just pointing this out, that was the bootstrapped methodology in the American system that I think is probably certainly needed, because I do think that the South African constitutional order on paper, in theory, is the best legal system in the world. It really is. It's just been institutionally corrupted by institutionally corrupt entities like the current government, that has been able to appoint judges and has able to, in some sense, promote this racialist doctrine of identity politics, which has become this kind of international fad, therefore allowing this general degradation and deterioration of, in some sense, I think, arguably, structurally, the greatest democracy on the planet. So it's sad. I mean, obviously, I guess I am saying that structurally because, obviously when the government committed itself to keeping many rural people uneducated so that they couldn't properly participate in politics and they could continue to count on low information voters to perpetuate, their klepto sort of oligarchical form of it's sort of like it's a it's an oligarchy disguised as a liberation front. Is basically the problem that we sit with. Um, and and this is the kind of corruption that you're going to, as identity politics becomes, if it does become the rule and the norm, and it does get, as it proliferates, we're all going to end up with unaccountable politics, as unaccountable as the Russian political system, as unaccountable as the Chinese political system. It's a very sad state of affairs. Okay, well, this is an addendum to my recording. I'm just going to, I just figured I'd more pointedly and perhaps for emphasis focus on my main thesis, which is that what fascist culture and the normalization of fascistic politics does to a society psychologically is that you are creating a kind of a social psychology which is entrenched in a kind of in an ideological dogma or orthodoxy or worldview, and everyone sort of toes that line, and that the function of that is actually for individuals to indulge in their own relativistic moral bubble, as it were. And essentially, the social psychology or the ideology is uh, is a conduit for that. It's a way to inject one's internal moral relativism and project it onto the world through essentially an agreed upon social convention, which has gained a kind of cultural hegemony, and no one is allowed to speak against it. Everyone has to toe that line. And so you have a kind of automatic audience. You have an automatic sort of peanut gallery that is supporting you. And yeah, I mean, I didn't go into this in enough detail because there's some interesting. I mean, I'll just try to illustrate it so that one can picture it. But I mean, you can often see it in the quite. I mean, I see them as very sort of psychologically dysfunctional sort of displays of when people are indulging in this kind of ideology and feeling so called empowered by you know these sorts of these implicit blanket accusations which are thrown at the system and society, um, where essentially you have replaced essentially having your own positive value system and worldview, which you are which you have to create. Instead, everyone else has to agree with your language. Everyone else has to take on your convention. To mend the history or whatever the mythology is around the systemic oppression, and the damage to your identity and the damage to your sort of vehicle of power, or the essentialism. So it is also weirdly incoherent on this point. Especially in the different wedge camps within identity politics. The mythology that feminism uses is incompatible with essentially the mythology around some of the other sort of identity fluidity stuff. Even to get relativism off the ground, it has to be it has to take something in its mythology, has to be taken as a kind of sacrosanct, permanent feature of the world itself, and frankly, they can't agree on these things. The only thing that they can agree on is the scapegoat, is essentially the thing that caused the kind of the inherited upset or the implicit sort of laden innate structure, so they they've worked out the thing that is evil, that is displacing all the good things, but they can't actually agree on what the good sort of end game would be, or what the reset point would look like, because they fundamentally have a different morality play, because essentially these things only service relativism, moral relativism. Um, and all the pantheons of the kind of abstract categorization, and which is, kind of has to be woven into a narrative of suppression and oppression, um, mean that you have to invent categories which uh, uh, um, are the way to combine the present and history. And so some category, some abstract concept in history has been badly treated by the ruling cultural hegemon and the white male patriarchy, or whatever it is. And then that has cast a shadow and is reflected in the present, in how that category has inherited essentially an unjustly weaker identity that needs to be given some redistributed attention and power. And so it's sort of in extracting that deficit from a scapegoat, and getting a scapegoat to essentially make room, or to concede some ground or something like that, that the revolution is sort of, so it's a kind of, but it's not a revolution in any kind of tangible terms, material terms, although it can have reflections in those things. It's a psychological revolution. It is essentially, it's a never-ending psychological uh, uh, position. And if that psychological position is not rehabilitated, does not feel ameliorated and remedied, then it can just continue to essentially invent accusations and claims of feeling overshadowed. And so, it is fundamentally premised on its own grievance, and essentially it can do this endlessly, so long as it doesn't belong its own, so long as its own identity and culture does not belong to it, because that's the general claim, and that's the general fascistic theme, is that people do not own their own identity and culture, that they belong to the system, and that they have been mangled by the system, and therefore the system owes them a kind of redress. And so as long as you can make an identitarian claim on that level, you have an infinite lever to essentially, is a one size fits all solution, essentially. But in the meantime, that process defers democratic literacy, it defers actually real empowerment, which requires self determinism and responsibility and accountability, which can't even get off the ground if you don't own your own identity or your culture. So you're making a kind of existential claim that who you are has been fundamentally damaged in an incalculable way, in a weirdly, the epistemic injustice is the word that they threw around, kind of from the philosophical quadrant of this. And epistemic injustice, where the epistemic justice pertains not to the individual but to the group, to some kind of group entity, is, I would say, already kind of fundamentally fascistic. But the idea that, I mean, who knows what epistemic injustice could be? It cannot be even thought about, because if the truth has been hurt, if there has been an injustice done to the truth of the world, or the truth of something, that means that epistemic injustice is not recoverable. You can't do anything with epistemic. If you could reverse epistemic injustice, it wouldn't be epistemic injustice. It would be tangible. You could reduce it to pragmatic terms. You could reduce it to very clear demarcations. But because essentially it's all grounded in this claim that no, the social psychology needs to be uh, um, needs to be repaired is a weirdly paradoxical sort of conundrum that is a never ending. Um, it's a fundamentally fudged uh, um, and fudging intellectual program. That is in some sense true in the interpretive way in which you can always make it true, and you can always, lies and statistics and such. It's a narrative that is not even defined in under its own sort of substantive. It doesn't have stable definitions to even be able to make this general claim. um, and again, all of these problems in some sense just get shunted off onto the scapegoat. It, it just becomes part of the of if it's confusing, it's because history has been so manhandled by the scapegoat. So it's kind of got um, uh, such a broad, vague, and nebulous formulation of the evil that it is fighting, that it even comes to assuage its own. But anyway, so in some sense, probably the most retrograde and regressive thing about these forms of thinking is that if there are defects in someone's culture, if there are defects in someone's identity, they can never be properly dealt with, because essentially, it's as if the fascist or the proto-fascist says, well, we do actually have, the problem is inside of us, it's not inside of other people. The problem is in us because we've been infiltrated, or whatever, we've internalized the oppression or something like that, is their calculation of it. But essentially, because they can't just say this part of our culture or this part of our identity doesn't comport with pragmatism or reality, and instead of negotiating how we want to live in a world that is structured as it is structured, with other people, with the language as it is, instead of sort of going along and getting along and actually building something real and positive or something like that, it's much easier just to kind of incept everyone into a kind of morality play in which you can eject the component of your own maladministration, as it were, and to give it over to the scapegoat and say, you installed this into me, therefore I don't have to clean it up, you have to change the environment. uh, um, in some I mean, that's my abstract reduction of the trade that is happening there. Is that they are conceding to the power of the external locus of control, and therefore they get to indulge in their slave morality. But the yes, sorry, I'm trying to explore the element in which the language games that are played, and the kind of the shifting of the burden of proof, and the kind of the the gainsaying of a kind of an orthodoxy that essentially that um, you know that you can just kind of unilaterally redefine what words mean, and what people mean when they use words, in order to essentially impute onto people um, accusations that are built into the identitarian mythology. Um, that kind of subversion, and sort of pulling the rug out from under other people's feet, is the kind of the necessary way in order to, that being normalized is basically the kernel of the fascistic atmosphere in culture, and the normalization of fascistic politics, that by your own interpretation you can sort of re-puppet and reanimate other people's grammar to fit your relativistic perspective. And when you so-called empower people to be able to relativistically reframe things in that way, you've obviously created a world in which things become very fractious. You actually destroy meaning. You destroy the ability for people to communicate. It's sort of like saying, well, if I can't use communication to I don't just want to say win a power game, or if I can't use communication to get other people to through persuasion and negotiation see things my way and make concessions to me, um, I'm going to use I'm going to threaten communication itself by essentially creating uh, I'm going to take communication hostage, um, and essentially use it in a selective way. So essentially, and this is done generally, I think, in order to insulate the dogma and the ideological worldview from ever having to take account of itself, or to create a substantive defense of its own structure. So it sort of it always stands unchallenged because it's just a kind of relativistic narrative, and you've normalized people indulging in that relativistic narrative. Um, so I mean, this is why I call it sort of fundamentally bad faith, because you're just sort of you are directly vomiting and projecting onto other people, and there is no within how the projection is occurring. It's completely unilateral, um, and that almost proves its own point. It's self-referencing in that sense, because it needs to be self-referencing and unilateral in order to solve its own conundrum, which is sadly a spiraling, um, never-ending, self-aggravating uh, process and program of accusations. Um, and transmuting all life concerns into generalized accusations, um, that were inherited in the system, as if, well, if I have a problem, it should have already been solved by how society should have counterfactually developed itself in order to uh, um, remedy this problem that I'm experiencing, because I'm experiencing it based on my the weakness in my identity, or the defect that I've inherited in my culture that wasn't already essentially empowered, so that you have been oppressed and disempowered. Therefore, the system owes you redress of that accusation. So as long as you can sort of generalize the accusation through the instrument of the identity that has inherited, bad things, and there's essentially there's always this blurred line, um, as to the individual psychology and essentially the social psychology. And because that line never gets bootstrapped, it never gets demarcated. You just have this never-ending fudged access to a kind of extraction of morality, or moral vampirism that clothes itself in a kind of moral language, which is ironically fundamentally disempowering, and sort of self-aggravating in its own, in indulging in its own sort of how it operates is fundamentally dysfunctional, and then it has to kind of repurpose that dysfunction as essentially the problem in the system. I mean, that is not to say that systems and societies don't have defects and they don't have deficiencies, and that they couldn't be better. But in some sense, I see them as the conglomeration of many individuals. And if you don't like how individuals act as groups or as individuals, then you need to actually model an alternative, or you need to actually work out how to solve a problem or something like that, because things don't just happen by accident. And to a large extent, we are, in some sense, the arithmetic of the average of people's individual decision making and and worldviews. The average of people's general beliefs. And just because some beliefs are more generally held than others means that yes, there will be, on an abstract reductive level, on a social level, there will be, some things that are more readily known, and some things that will be less understood by the general person. And that can be calculated as a kind of social power or something like that. But maybe things that happen in the world that only affect a minute percentage of the population should not be the intense subject of study of everyone. Like maybe it's just not uh, um, like the idea that everyone needs to be plugged in to an even keeled knowledge database that you know uh, is I mean it itself, like, fundamentally, um, to turn life itself into a kind of hypothetical, is to plug it into a very stupid philosophy machine that has dictated, certain, basic nebulous concepts that have not been even thought about deeply enough to even make them coherent and cogent as a bundle of so-called values. All the hollow lip service, that is used, and the hollow phrases of social justice. I mean, the Nazis would have also called themselves fighters for social justice. I mean, it doesn't mean anything unless it actually makes sense in some kind of comprehensive understanding of something. And just because you're able to have a program which is, I would say, fundamentally flawed and based on a dysfunctional, um, yeah. Anyway, so okay, I'm ranting now about essentially uh, the futility of the supposed aims of people who have adopted this um, creed and form of belief. And I mean, that kind of relativism as well, I think, is essentially is a kind of solipsism. It is a kind of autistic, um, you know, there's an implicit dehumanization of the other in it, in categorizing people um, in the way that it does. And I guess let me just talk about some basic. I mean, I think it's useful to ask people questions uh, um, about their identity, to use words like that. It's like, or if it's in your personal life, it can be relevant to know if your friends, what their sexuality is, for instance, is probably an important thing to know. If you don't know these things, I mean, how much do you really know about them? Imagine if you asked what someone's sexuality, and the answer to their question was, well, everyone is fluid or something like that. I mean, or they give you some kind of ideological tidbit. Well, now, I mean, essentially, they've said, well, the question is a wrong question, or they've essentially said no comment, or they have, and then, I mean, I mean, it is true that if someone has expresses a sexuality, it doesn't mean that they can't change that expression later on. Um, and they could have perhaps put that in their answer. Well, for now, I went through this. Now I'm in a different phase, and I'm through this, or what. I mean, there's a whole, who knows, like, but to essentially fob the question, or like, in some sense, sexuality, I think, is more real than something like race. I mean, like race or ethnicity, or the genetic component of your biology, or whatever. I mean, is in some sense only really relevant. I would think for healthcare and doctors, and if they can work out, that there are different kinds of susceptibility to different kinds of things, or something like that. But uh, I mean, I think also that there is the psychological, this also gets us so, all the social psychology stuff means that we can never look at actually what things mean in psychological terms, because we're sort of being diverted and distracted by, I mean, I think that sexuality is a huge reflection on, well, not the only reflection, but it's one of the mirrors that reflect something about psychological constitution. Um, Obviously, other components are perhaps more important as well, but it's one of the manifestations of. Anyway, I mean, I think that there are many different species of sexuality, essentially, um, that correspond to different uh, subtypes of uh, structure of personality. But anyway, but uh, what's my point? So, I think that there is, generally speaking, when I talk about sort of bootstrapping, owning your own identity and your own culture and your own sexuality, for that matter, um, then, I mean, I do philosophically fundamentally see it as a kind of, that you have an ironic attachment to these things. Um, I mean, maybe that's almost like that's my spiritual opinion or point of view, or something like that. Um, as my understanding of epistemic responsibilism. But yeah, I did. I don't know how neatly this segues, but want to say that, I do think that in some sense, liberal democratic society, psychological truths, personal truths, internal truths are, that they are the thing that you are there perhaps to take responsibility for, and therefore to refine them, and then enjoy a freedom of association in order to see if it can manifest into something, or a project, or a collective project, um, around those shared values, perhaps. Um, when you have a culture that's based on a kind of strange kind of social psychology blurred line between the individual and society, which, I mean, I know in practical terms there's always a kind of an intermix, or a bleed over, which is why I think it's important to have something like the marketplace of ideas and things like that, and some variety. But but notwithstanding the intolerance paradox, because you have to be intolerant of intolerance essentially. But it's amazing how these fascists use that as their excuse essentially to promulgate their evening of cultural power, because people don't own their own culture. They have dispossessed individuals of culture as they belong to these collective entities of identitarian ilk, and almost like gods in a pantheon. That blackness and whiteness are the moral entities and the moral agents, and we are just representatives and reflections of that pantheon. Um, but what's the contrast that I'm trying to make? I'm trying to juxtapose that um, a culture that is fundamentally obsessed and focused and fixated on the social psychology as an overriding way of defining the individual. And fascists do this explicitly. um, Means that essentially that they can talk about psychology by talking about history, and they can try to change culture by also talking about alien influences. So it's like, instead of saying, oh, we need a different culture, we need to improve things, they instead say, this thing that we have about us was imprinted upon us, was put upon us by other people. We adopted it because they injected it into us. So you know and essentially is as if they can't get out of bed and improve society without essentially defining that the thing that they want improved is evil, and it was set upon them. So they essentially they have to reduce everything into a kind of defiance of a narrative that has a scapegoat. And anyway, and again, I'll just say that this is why Professor Lushaba at UCT is such a disgusting intellectual who should not have tenure, who should not be given public funds to promote his disgusting worldview, and his disgusting fascist politics and his pseudo-intellectualism. And why Brett Weinstein, who essentially gives credence to this kind of bullshit, this kind of pseudo-intellectualism, should also feel ashamed that he doesn't understand, let's say, these principles well enough. Um, that he's also fine to say, oh yeah, your identity is disempowered, or your culture is infected with something that has been given to it by the state of social psychology, which is to essentially to disperse responsibility into an abyss of a neb. I mean, like, where are you placing the the onus? Then it gets lost. Where are you placing the point of uh, sorry, I'm trying to think of the word. I'm trying to think of the word that means the it's kind of like the word that means that the basic building blocks of having of building uh, like a solution or seeing something, because you just at that point you lose track of all the ingredients that you would need in order to constitute a an answer. It's like you're allowing yourself to sort of use this sort of this dark magic of pulling the wool over your eyes, and just because that seems intellectually sympathetic to just say, oh yeah, well, yeah, that's because evil people, evil agents in history did something in order to hurt a group of people on purpose. Therefore, we can just define all of history as a reaction to someone's evil agency. You know, never mind actually looking in detail, like what was the actual impact compared to other people's impacts of, I mean, completely closing your eyes to the fact that not everyone went along with that, not everyone was duped or something like that, or some people were duped and some people weren't duped, or some people then did other things. Like legal causation is an interesting concept. There are lots of different theories of legal causation, but you know, at some point you get a novus. Um, I can't remember the full Latin phrase actually, but something that breaks the legal chain of causation. It's like someone might have been reckless and they were doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, but then somebody else actually did something more reckless, and then somebody else then did something intentional after a situation was already created. And it's like, well, who should be responsible for what outcome when the outcome was dictated by a confluence of different, so just because you have one person that intended to do harm and they had a plan doesn't mean that the plan was only effected under their own um, very rarely do plans involve grabbing other people's limbs and forcing their limbs by absolute force to do something. And there's, even in the legal system, there's a very high bootstrap of reasonableness that the individual is expected to express and to contend their lives with. Well, should they have believed that? Should they have followed that? Should they have, this is why generally I think that I blame the electorate and society for the state of culture by and large. But anyway, um, uh, let me just revisit what I was just talking about and clean up two of the points that I made near the end there. A little bit of awkward, a little bit awkward for me to sort of start talking in the first person to give an example and not illustrate the general principle of the point. Suffice to say that every element of identity is potentially relevant and useful in the context provided by an individual's purpose and their particular culture of how they wish to associate or what's important to them. That individuals should have their own purposes. The idea that each individual that has their own set of purposes and values and their own preferences or whatever produce a kind of confluence that has a kind of aggregated effect on a general culture or something like that, or that a culture can be reduced into therefore certain generalizations or themes or something like that, is by the by. That is informed by individuals having their own purposes. If you don't like the purposes that individuals have, um, then do something to change the culture. But I do think that this form of totalitarian takeover by an orthodoxy, and in some sense that people's purposes must be issued to them by a theory of social psychology that everyone must be plugged into in order to download some rubric, or that governs and mediates the problems between these abstract pantheons of entities of moral consideration like blackness and whiteness, which are taken to be sort of the prime source of both reality but also morality, is fundamentally disempowering and dislocates the individual from their own purposes. That the purpose is somewhat sanctioned and part of a collective program to advance, this abstract ideation of your race or your gender or your identity or something like that. That you are essentially um, an extension of the humanity that is fundamentally or philosophically associated or sourced from that category, um, which is a way of sort of dehumanizing humanity from individual purposes, and overriding those purposes with a kind of hypothetically eternal or everlasting, kind of conservation of some identitarian anyway. So, and then just to retouch one of the other points that I raised is the very strange thing, and why these wedge issues and these different identity, why feminism and transgenderism, why they're fundamentally incompatible, is because in order to ground everything in some kind of identitarian essentialism, you have to therefore believe in a worldview or believe in a mythology that actually holds that particular slice of analysis that constitutes that kind of identity as being fundamentally permanent, or fundamentally basic, or fundamentally prime in the mind, foremost in its essentialism, or something like that. And if you, which is usually this problem philosophically is basically outsourced. It's like, oh, well, actually race doesn't mean anything, but it's socially constructed, and because the enemy has used it to attack us, therefore the scapegoat is why we must essentially be plugged into a racial essentialism. They just kind of pass the buck on that one. But philosophically, hypothetically, they are, they pretend to be non-racialists or something like that. So it's like, the same kind of trickery or whatever. Like, oh, it would be nice if we could already imagine the morality of the reset point, but until we reach this never-ending goalpost shifting reset point, we have to indulge in this racial essentialism. It's the only way, or something like that. Because people can't make the moral adjustments. We can't progressively live in a better society. We have to, ironically, indulge in the thing that we say that we're against. So I mean, it's fundamentally locked in its own kind of paradoxical conundrum. It's self-aggravating in that way. But if you'll take the de facto point that I'm making, that they are basically some kind of identitarian essentialists in some form or another, that essentialism and that historical mythology that anchors that essentialism will be anchored into a particular narrative, like, oh, okay, well, um, I mean, for feminists in this current wave of feminism that is this kind of identitarianism, it's like, well, woman just for being born woman has this has this lineage of inherited, internalized cultural, you know, um, baggage, and that obviously doesn't quite comport um, with at least some section of trans activism in which everything is fluid and essentially, things are, gender is decreed by relativistic, sort of election that can change daily. And so, because they're not even willing to define themselves as behavior, but they're sort of, no, no, no. Well, if I declare myself uh, um, to be this, I get to kind of colonize language and grammar and meaning, and everybody else must adopt my convention, and I don't have to persuade and argue for it. It must just be acceded to. And in some sense, I mean, all the identitarian issues are like this because their narrative and their mythology is just considered to be, it must be unquestioningly duplicated. It must just automatically be installed in people's, let's say, morality framework. Otherwise, they're bad people. So instead of actually having to win an argument or a debate, um, anyway, but the point is that like those actual narratives and those mythologies, uh, they have certain basic assumptions that about, let's say, the basic counterfactual or moral ideal which was distorted by the historical evilness. And so because of the deviation from their standard of their ideal, and why we don't already live in an ascended culture that already has the nice things having to do with the mythology of that particular identity, um, you know, like so that their whole attitude and their whole activism and their position and getting other people to imprint the mythology and respond and be reactive to the mythology that they're broadcasting and projecting onto society and individuals in the present. That is all the cause of the ongoing systemic oppression to their identity facet. But the thing that they want other people to be imprinted on is antithetical to the liberation of somebody else's basic ideal as to what would have prevented the their systemic oppression. So these systemic oppressions essentially are incoherently unmanageable, which is why essentially if you don't have an identity mythology that um, is capable of reproducing the state and is capable of reproducing, at least hypothetically capable of reproducing a way of life, famously the Nazis' blood and soil and genetics, um, because genetics, having a superior genetics or whatever the mythology is, includes reproduction, male and female. So it's capable of at least reproducing the family unit. And blood and soil is something that is like a national identity. But feminism can't really develop a nationalism. All these identitarianism. I mean, well, the exception to this would be the kind of the BLM movement, or so like things that are basically racially based do have a capacity to essentially create some kind of state uh, um, modeled after conserving that identity. because it's broad enough, it's generic enough, essentially. So anyway, the idea that all of these people share the same scapegoat, at least, allows them to work side by side, shoulder to shoulder to some degree, but they can't really, if they have to share a political party, they can't actually service their own ideology sufficiently, because they're essentially vying against one another, because their basic mythology, their basic narrative is corrosive to even their own style of politics, which is why Hitler would have just called these people useful idiots, because they are basically broadcasting the general format, but then they are considered to be, because they don't essentially have a natural political translation of themselves. And so they're basically just normalizing fascistic politics and culture until someone represents a kind of Führer figure, the savior of the identity, but it has to be an identity that's capable of reproducing the state and reproducing society. It has to be a broad enough identity that can service that. But you still have all the cultural problems in that you are endorsing a culture that is fundamentally stupid. So although this ideology can be used to create a new aristocracy, a new kind of ruling elite that is based on supposedly advancing the interests of the identity and being a guardian class of the identity, it has so much intrinsic exploitation and ideological, sort of social manipulation woven into it, that it's like neo-feudalism. It's basically, I mean, people forget this, but in the feudal time, religion was not that big. I mean, compared to the monarchy and compared to the national identity. I mean, you could change your religion and it would be less psychologically damaging than changing your nationality. I mean, when the Scottish were dispossessed by their aristocracy, I mean, it's like in China when emperors were deposed by Mongolians, whole towns committed suicide. It's there's nothing to live for. King and country, there's no mention of religion in that. The national identity is essentially at the core of the psychological mythology in some sense. It gives a context, and the development of liberalism and essentially the purpose of life being manifested on the individual scale, for the individual to explore and make inroads into and construct a meaning of life that wasn't bestowed upon them as through some kind of infantilism, was essentially a hugely civilizing drive that created a depth of civility that was not even possible. And I would say that there was somewhat, the re-emergence of fascistic culture is something like the darkest tendency of certain sections of the population within certain psychological schemas, to have a social psychology which is sort of enforced and sanctions the individual to indulge in their own private relativism and to empower that relativism to exert itself. That the world is small and makes sense. That the world is really quite simple. never mind the kind of I almost want to say the spiritual damage that one is taking on in order to accomplish this. The indulgence in a kind of in a slave morality. You know, that everything can be gauged as essentially an accusation against a single scapegoat. Um, and then you can imagine that everybody else, if they make any progress in this life at all, it's essentially that you're all fighting together in the same conflagration against the same inherited, that you're fighting under the pantheon of reasserting your essential identity against another essential identity that has poisoned the system, because you're unwilling to conceive of yourself as an individual that makes choices and that other individuals make choices. And so, it's one way to kind of expand your own private sense of self in quite a psychologically dishonest way, to sort of engulf and to it's sort of like seeing yourself as a hive, as part of a bustling dynamic hive that is under siege by you know you, I mean, at the very least, you have to kind of have an eternal Cold War. I mean, that was Hitler's sort of end game, was not even that you destroy the scapegoat, but that you kind of, or that you take. Hitler supposedly did not really want to take over the world. What he wanted to do was to live side by side to some degree in a kind of with very strong borders, so that you would have to organize within your own borders, because if you didn't stay strong, and then essentially you would be taken over, a kind of an eternal Cold War between different ethnicities and different societies, developing in their own bubble, in their own sphere of control and influence. And anyway, and at least that kind of overt fascism has some. I mean, I don't think you could ever actually manage sustaining itself psychologically, because I don't think that the perpetual Cold War, as it were, would even be able. I mean, if you just look at the Nazi propaganda, you could just tell that it was psychologically unsustainable. It was getting more and more insane. And in the same way that in the woke ideology, it's sort of the internalized uh, uh, white supremacy, the internalized Jewish conspiracy of the Nazi people. It's sort of it it gets more and more ludicrous, and so you can never even develop as a society, because you become so wooden, because anyone who steps out of line is doing so because they're being puppeted by the so you end up just creating such a wooden authoritarian oppressive state, but because the nature of the politics is so toxic and poisonous, it's not capable of um, you've perhaps you get completely locked into a never-ending darkness that can never be woken up from, in some sense, because the apparatus, the radical apparatus that is developed in order to cleanse the society, is essentially like 1984 Big Brother. So it's something that you can never wake up from. It's a kind of dystopian, perhaps the path that sort of China is going, and it's very disgusting that the state of the West culturally is so unhealthy, because again, if the state of culture in the West were better, just as as a cultural example, there would be so much more pressure on the Chinese. But now their state propaganda can almost credibly say, look at how stupid the politics of democracy is. Look at how vacuous and, sort of wishy-washy and easily, you know, uh, it's and in some sense you could say that the point of China and Russia, and perhaps even, I mean, you could even throw in Islam here. I mean, in some readings, what Hitler really wanted to do was to create a cultural, political machine that did the same thing that Islam did. Um, an organizing principle that could perform large, long-term projective planning and power, and consolidation of power over the long term and such, that in theory could do these things, but in such a pernicious and virulent way that I don't think it's culturally or psychologically sustainable. Um, but what was I saying? What was the point of this? I brought that up just to. I mean, as if long-term planning cannot be part of a liberal democratic order, and cannot be part of a constitution, and framework. I mean, I personally think that it would be the role of the public protector in the South African democracy to say, well, for future generations to take on a debt, inherited debt, because of the extravagance of the state to not be fiscally responsible, that is essentially unconstitutional. I mean, I think that that's perfectly in order. That if the government is not capable of using deficit spending in order to materially raise the quality of life of its citizens, then essentially it's obviously not working, and it's not worth the trade off, and it's not worth the debt to future generations. The idea that if you live in a bad situation, that then you can use that as a pretext to more extravagantly mismanage funds and get access to more funds, because essentially you've deferred the cost into the future, and you've generally sunk the general uh, uh, resources of a country. But yeah, I mean, I think that there are enough institutional instruments, potentially in a liberal democracy, a democracy founded on liberal values, that you can have the same sense of civic nationalism, and or at least education in civics, that are part of a culture. And in some sense, it is more important that these forms of I mean, this is the cost of freedom. Is that, if culture itself doesn't is not willing to sort of bootstrap and take on responsibility for itself, if it has to be led by the neck, if it has to, to the trough to eat, by, I mean, in some sense, it should be led by elites. But when I say elites, I mean like what I'm trying to provide here. I mean, this is a form of an intellectual or a wannabe intellectual elite projecting a message. But I mean, in an elite in the marketplace of ideas. I mean, that is the function of having elites, is that you have to have a conversation, you have to have content, um, but if people don't choose that content, I mean, it is, I think, eminent. Alan Watts, I don't know if this is his original quote, but I've heard it from Alan Watts. People get the government that they deserve in the long term, and I think that that is eminently correct. And in some sense, the idea that you don't already have a packaged culture that is automatically capable of reproducing itself and conserving itself is a reflection of the state of society and culture in a free society. I mean, it's conspicuously worse when you're dealing with political actors that are overtly, cynically disempowering people and promoting things that are fundamentally, let's say, extractive and sort of divisive in order to and when people go along with that, it looks particularly egregious. It looks particularly like an oligarchy. Which is what I think is the establishment of a plutocracy. But the plutocracies that have existed before had the excuse that society was not a free society, that society did not have universal suffrage. We don't live in such a situation. We do have universal adult suffrage. So you cannot put that anywhere on any doorstep other than the electorate themselves and the people themselves. And in some sense, the content of their character. And, if this is what people want to vote for, if this is what they end up voting for, I mean, you can't pass the buck. And doing so is essentially to degrade the very thing that supposedly, if you want a well-functioning free society, the buck cannot be passed here. Otherwise, you end up sort of making a sort of a self-contradiction. So, I mean, I do think that the most effective political messaging at the moment should be to indict the electorate of democracies and what they choose to vote for, to some degree. And if they have been duped by social manipulation and these narratives and uncritically adopting things, then that is what they should be indicted for. That is what I think that is the best, that is the most responsible form of political commentary that is needed at this time. Is to examine the state of the literacy in democracy, as it were. Okay, so I've belabored the point. I don't know if I want to recover the other point that I made. I think although it was somewhat of a stupid point, but just the status of is this identitarian left wing or right wing, which usually just ends me ragging on Brett Weinstein for indulging in reducing people to sort of historical effects of somebody else's agency, and because somebody actually wanted to be a controlling force and somebody else fell for it, then everything that person does is just an effect of that moral agency and how they characterize themselves or their rationale for having that untoward effect means that we're locked into this eternal theme, instead of just saying, no, actually, the reason why these things perpetuate themselves is because you have some people who are not willing to take responsibility for their own substandard culture, that is fundamentally allergic to self-determinism and responsibility. And they use the excuse that because they were undermined because of the rationale that they themselves now have adopted and inculcate within their own self-identity, means that they have just essentially doubled down on slave morality in the Nietzschean sense. That they disempower themselves culturally and psychologically, and therefore they are excused to continue to do so, is disgusting. And obviously it comes to no avail to simply give intellectual sympathy to that intellectual position. But Weinstein loves providing intellectual sympathy to this never-ending cycle of self-aggravating disempowerment. But that does seem to be a left trope in some sense, that quite disgustingly so. I'm almost afraid to say this, but there are some elements of Marxist analysis. I mean, I still consider myself to be somewhat of a Marxist thinker in my analysis of things. But anyway, that's somewhat a tangent. But I mean, I just have a different model of the solution to the fundamental problems. I would be called a left Marxist, not a Leninist, essentially. That I believe that you can have your revolution on the private scale inside a proper functioning democracy. You don't need to take over the state. You don't need to go through the Marxist, Marxist-Leninist paranoia that leads you to essentially installing the same kind of abortion of a society and a culture that has to preemptively react. I mean, that's what Leninism is that, well, we're going to win anyway because of history, therefore let's do it early, because if we don't do it early, then we won't have the ability to do it at all. Which is ironic, because these people who try to bring down society as it stands, in some sense, are, I would say, very clearly setting up sort of virtue signaling value chains that help to entrench oligarchs and undermine independent small entrepreneurs and things like that, and small and medium businesses. And anyway, not going to get into the weeds on this kind of issue. Let me not go down that whole rabbit hole. But anyway, let me stop this recording now.